Namaskar, good evening, and good morning to those on the other part of the globe. I welcome you to the 10th annual Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture. Due to the still ongoing pandemic situation, we have had to conduct this lecture online for the second consecutive year. Last year, we had the honor and pleasure of hosting Shri Jyotirindra Moitra as our speaker, who delivered the first online lecture, which proved to be a success, encouraging viewers from all parts of the globe. Taking advantage of this disadvantageous situation, this year's memorial lecture is also being held online, inviting global viewers and audience to enjoy it. With an eye on the ongoing birth centenary celebrations of Satyajit Ray, we approached an eminent member of the Ray family to deliver this year's memorial lecture. We also had in mind the close association my father had with Satyajit Ray. Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Trust is honored to have Shri Prasadranjan Ray as this year's guest speaker. We are grateful to him for readily complying to our request and finding time from his busy schedule to oblige us. With a heavy heart, I condole the loss of Shapunda, Professor Shapan Chakraborty, who delighted us with the 8th Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture in 2019, which also happened to be the last offline lecture that was held before the onset of the pandemic. It has been a great personal loss as well as a general loss that is irreparable. Earlier this year, we lost Shirsha Bandopadhyay, a powerful contemporary author who had read a brilliant story for us at a story reading session for the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Trust in 2019. We are dedicating today's lecture to these two lives lost so untimely, as they had so much to offer in the coming times. I now have the honor and pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Shri Prasadranjan Ray. Prasadranjan Ray was born to a Brahmo family in Calcutta. This Brahmo family was none other than the illustrious Ray family that can boast of names like Upendra Kishore Raychaudhuri, Kulodaranjan Ray, Pramodaranjan Ray, Leela Majumdar, Shukumar Ray, and many other notable members, culminating in Satyajit Ray. Prasadranjan Ray studied physics at Presidency College, University College of Science, and the Shah Institute of Nuclear Physics, before joining the Indian Administrative Service in 1972. He held various important assignments, including Principal Secretary, Home Department, Additional Chief Secretary, Higher Education Department, and Chairperson of the Electricity Regulatory Commission in West Bengal. He was also a Hubert Humphrey Fellow in 1980-81 at Cornell University, earning the degree of Master of Professional Studies in International Agriculture and Rural Development, apart from a certificate in Development Economics from the University College of London in 1991. He retired from his illustrious career in government service in 2013 and has been involved with a number of organizations dealing with children's literature, wildlife and environment education, rural development and social welfare, and he has also been involved with the family magazine Shantesh, apart from more than a dozen published books, including edited works. He is currently the president of the Brahmo Sammelan Samaj and the Elmhurst Institute of Community Studies. He is also associated with Robindra Charcha Kendra and Shishu Kishore Academy, West Bengal. A man of myriad interests, he has carried on the legacy of his legendary family with admirable brilliance and humility. I now request Shri Prasadranjan Ray to deliver the 10th Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture. Today's topic is Satyajit and the Ray family in the light of the Bengal Renaissance.
I am deeply honored at this request to speak on the 10th Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Lecture. At the same time, I feel a little awkward because really though he is such a towering figure of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, but I had never met him. And most of his working time, many of the working time in that period, he spent in Delhi working for the Shongit Natak Academy. When he came back to Calcutta in the last 3 years, and this is something many people do not know, he was working with children at Patha Bhavan and also with the Kamala Girls School. And for them, he composed wonderful songs for children, and he also adapted many plays which were produced for the school. And some of that I had the opportunity of seeing later. Also, since I have known Susmita and the whole family for quite some time, I suppose that gives me some right to speak on him, a person I had never seen. The committee requested me to speak on Satyajit Ray, the Ray family, and the Bengal Renaissance. Now, this is something which might raise eyebrows in the minds of purists, because now traditionally the Bengal Renaissance was supposed to cover a period from the early 19th century to maybe the 1920s, 30s, 40s, early 40s, that is Rabindranath's working period. But this Satyajit Ray's working period really started after that. So this goes a little beyond that. The logic behind proposing it like this, I will come to right at the end. To begin with, let me begin by saying that the Ray family is quite a large family and quite illustrious in many ways. Many people have compared it with the Thakur family, though I will not go into that, and comparisons are always odious. The Ray family, in fact, to begin with, it was called the Deb family because they belonged to a group called Dokhin Rari Kayassos, and the family title or upadhi was Deb. The patriarch of the Ray family from whom we start is a gentleman called Ramsundar Deb, who started from Chagda maybe in the 1580s and traveled all the way to northeastern Mymensingh, to the Pargana of Sherpur in search of employment. He worked there, he got married there, he stayed in a village called Joshodol, and later on moved to the Kachari. His descendants moved to the Kachari at Agaro Shindur. And then one of his descendants came and settled at the village of Moshua on the banks of the old course of the river Brahmaputra. And Moshua is what we normally relate to as our homeland. Though very few people in our generation have had the opportunity of seeing that. Of course, I was fortunate to see it twice, but considering the state of the present house, I do not think it's very much of a good fortune, but there it is. Ramsundar Deb, once he settled there, his descendants always worked in zamindari kacharis, sometimes for the Nawab of Dhaka, and they were given various titles. So some were known as Deb, some as Mojumdar, some as Rai, Khashnobish, Raychaudhuri, and even a branch which was known as Home or Home Rai. It was quite a large family. I find Mary Seaton, in her first biography of Satyajit, called it a Bengali banyan tree. And it is indeed like a banyan tree with many branches, and people branched off and they did many things. Now we begin the story at some time in the 1850s with Satyajit's great-grandfather, incidentally my own great-grandfather also. He was a gentleman who was known as Shamsundar Munshi, though his real name was Kalinath Rai. He was one who was a wizard at mathematics. He used to work in land records. He used to know Arabic, Persian and Sanskrit pretty well. He was known to be able to translate freely, even verse, from Arabic or Persian to Sanskrit and vice versa. Now this is, I think, a remarkable achievement, and he also had musical talents. Many of the family had musical talents. Shamsundar Munshi had 5 sons, and his nearest neighbor, also a distant cousin, was the Zamindar Harikishore Raychaudhuri, who at that time did not have a son, though he had 2 daughters. So he came to Shamsundar Munshi and asked to adopt one of his sons. And then it was decided that his second son, who was called Kamodaranjan Rai, would be given away in adoption to Jamindar Harikishore Raychaudhuri, and he was renamed Upendra Kishore Raychaudhuri. There is some confusion amongst people between the Rai and Raychaudhuri business, and this, I think, settles it. Now, of his 5 sons, I find all were quite well known, but the first 2, the eldest was Sharadaranjan Rai, and the second Upendra Kishore Raychaudhuri, were the most famous, very clearly. Sharadaranjan was a professor of Sanskrit and mathematics, a rather unusual combination these days, but he apparently specialized in that, and he was a favorite of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He taught in the government Dhaka College, he had taught at Aligarh earlier, and then ultimately came to Metropolitan College, which became known as Vidyasagar College later on. Also, in addition to this, he was a cricket enthusiast. He was a cricketer and a cricket coach. He is called the W.G. Grace of Bengal, or the father of modern Bengal cricket. He founded the first Bengali cricket team called Town Club. And this started a love affair with cricket that is lasted even till today. Sharadaranjan had 4 sons and 4 daughters, and one of his sons and one grandson had kept his publishing business alive till the other day. I don't really know whether it's functioning even now. He had written many textbooks on Sanskrit and also some on mathematics, and his S. Rai and Sons was his publishing company. Apart from that, he went into manufacture of sporting goods, and S. Rai and Company. He had a special way of manufacturing cricket bats here, bringing good quality willow from the northwest. He also used to make kites, and he was interested in angling, so he used to make baits for angling. And all that makes him a very rounded off kind of a person, not one who was merely a Sanskrit or mathematics professor, but one who had interest in very many things. Incidentally, he was also a very orthodox, rigid Hindu who observed all the Hindu rituals very rigorously. The second brother, Upendra Kishore, we will come to later on, since he is part of the main strand of the story. The third brother was Muktidaranjan, who was almost cast in the shadow of his eldest brother, except that he was even taller, 5 feet 11, he was tall and big, and he was a fantastic athlete. An athlete, a gymnast, bodybuilder, a cricketer, who played hockey and football and all other games. And like his eldest brother, he was also a professor of mathematics and Sanskrit. He had textbooks which apparently did not sell because the problems set there were too tough for the professors to solve. He had 6 sons and 2 daughters, and at least 2 of his sons played cricket for Bengal, first class cricket, and one of his grandsons also did likewise. So this is something that has kept the family linkage with cricket live up till the other day. I think Shivaji Rai, his grandson, is still doing some coaching. Then comes the 4th brother, Kuladaranjan, who has been referred to often by Satyajit in his small book, Jokhon Choto Chilam, since he is one who stayed with them. Kulodharanjan was also an interesting person. He was very good at cricket. He wrote extremely good Bengali. He worked in photo processing, engraving, enlargement, and so on. And he was remarkable at translating and adapting stories for children, which he did with Puranic tales, the legends of Greece and Rome, and then also translated books like The Talisman, Kenilworth, and so on, until even some of the Sherlock Holmes tales. I believe he was the first one in Bengali to translate Sherlock Holmes tales to do it, and they became very popular. Unfortunately, Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle's estate had some problems about rights, so ultimately these books were taken out of the market, and I have not been able to even take a glance at one of them. But he was indeed, he had one son and two daughters, and his two daughters were both good at writing for children. They are mentioned in Satyajit Ray's book. And the fifth and youngest son was Pramodaranjan, who was my grandfather. He was an engineer who joined the Survey of India. So he worked as surveyor in extremely difficult parts in northwest of India and northeastern India and Burma in the Shan Hills on the borders of Siam and China. And his experience there, he had noted down in a diary. And part of this came out in the old Sandesh as Boner Khobor was serialized. And much later, my aunt, Leela Mujumdar, compiled the whole thing into a book. So Boner Khobor is available now from the 1950s onwards in book form. Of his children, a number of his children did a bit of writing, but obviously the most famous was Leela Mujumdar, who is the leading children's literature of the 1960s, 70s, and even 1980s. And there are books like Holde Pakhir Palok and Tongling, Din Nedupure, which are really charmed children for generations. In fact, my father also did a bit of writing, and many of us have also followed that, but should not be compared with them. These are the five brothers. Of the three sisters, two of them, Giribala and Shoroshibala, stayed on in the village. One of them was widowed early, but they stayed there all their lives, hardly came to Calcutta. All the five brothers ultimately migrated to Calcutta in search of livelihood. The youngest sister, called Mrinalini, was married to a very interesting person called Hemendranath Bose, better known as H. Bose, also belonging to the scion of a noted Brahmo family of Mymensingh. And H. Bose was an inventor and an entrepreneur. So he set up H. Bose Perfumers, he set up the Great Eastern Motor Company, he set up a film processing company, he set up a record manufacturing company. In fact, he went into many things, including cycles. He introduced cycling to Calcutta and taught cycling to people like Jagadish Chandra, his wife, and Acharya Prafulla Chandra. And there are photographs saying the three of them trying to ride a bicycle and he being guided by H. Bose. Unfortunately, he died early, he died young at 50, just 2 years before Upendra Kishore. But of his children, there were no less than four who were known as the cricketing Bose brothers, who played cricket for Bengal. One of them represented India in an unofficial test, Kartik Bose, and became a commentator and cricket expert. One of his daughters, Malati Ghoshal, was an excellent exponent of Rabindra Sangeet. Hiten Bose, one of his elder sons, was very good at classical music. He knew Persian, he knew Sanskrit, he translated many tales, and he was a good artist. And two others, the first in this family to break into the world of filmmaking. Nitin Bose, who was known as Putul, and his younger brother Mukul. Nitin Bose went into photography and filmmaking, directions, and Mukul Bose went into sound reprographics and other things. So even filmmaking, in which Satyajit blazed a trail for himself, is not new to this family. There are people who had ventured there, and maybe they held out some kind of a path for Satyajit to follow. So this is the immediate family in a way that rounds them off. But there are also people of the adoptive family that took over Upendra Kishore. After he was adopted in 1868, 2 years later, Jamindar Harikishore had his own son called Narendra Kishore. But that did not affect Upendra Kishore in any way. They were all very fond of both the children, and the two families lived side by side. So he grew up in close contact with both families, his real fathers and his adoptive father. In that family, there are people like Jyotirindra Raychaudhuri and others who worked for the government and wrote a bit. From their writings, we come to know a lot about the stories concerning the village of Masua and what used to happen there, what life there was around. And one of his daughters had two children two sons who were M. Dotto Rai and J. Dotto Rai. M. Dotto Rai in particular, they both played cricket, but M. Dotto Rai in particular became a great cricket, football and Olympic administrator in India, not just at the Bengal level, but at all India level. So they were quite famous people in that branch also. Now let me come back to Upendra Kishore. In his younger days, he took to drawing, sketching and painting, and also music. It is said that he learned to play many musical instruments by himself, and he was the first in the family to study at Mymensingh Zilla School. And while studying there, he came into contact with some teachers and a few of his classmates who were Brahmos. So he was the first one in the family to be attracted to Brahmoism then. After he passed out the entrance examination with a scholarship, he came to Calcutta to study FA and thereafter BA, firstly at Presidency College and then at Metropolitan College. And he graduated in 1885. He had come into contact with people like Acharya Shivanath Shastri and Dwarkanath Gangopadhyay, and who the firebrand Brahmo preacher who held out for rights of women, and he married Dwarkanath's daughter. So he was the first one in the family to be formally inducted to the Brahmo faith, and he was married, though his father, his adoptive father, was a very rigid orthodox leader of the Hindu society back in Mymensingh. Now, he had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters, all of whom did a bit of writing, they could sketch, and they were quite talented people. But I'll come to the children later. What Upendra Kishore did was to set up a reprographic company called U. Rai Artist initially, later renamed U. Rai and Sons, and they did reprographics of various forms, photography, printing, and all kinds of things allied with that. Along with that, he became very close to Rabindranath, though they belonged to different branches of the Brahmo Samaj. It's believed that he went to Jorashaku regularly and accompanied Rabindranath in his pakhowaj, which he was very fond of playing. And Rabindranath was very fond of that. Rabindranath was also fond of his sketches, so he drew a set of sketches to accompany Rabindranath's long poem, Nodi for Children, which was published in book form. There are many other connections. For example, he became close to Dwarkanath Ghosh, who is the famous creator of the Dwarkin flute, the first table harmonium. And it was really the Dwarkin press from which his first 2 books, Shikhak Bati Reke Harmonium Shikha and Behala Shikha, were published. Unfortunately, these books are hardly available. Only the second one, I believe, is available now, but Harmonium Shikha, very few people have seen its original form. That is also because he, like his friend Rabindranath, decided later that the harmonium was spoiling the beauty of Indian music. So he took that book out of print, out of circulation. He also started writing from a young age. He wrote for Shokha, Shathi, Shokha or Shathi, then Mukul, and ultimately he came out with his own children's magazine, Shandesh, in 1913. But that came quite a bit later. In between, he took to developing new methods of half-tone printing. And there were such methods that set the world alight literally. No less than 9 of his articles were published in the Penrose's Pictorial Annual, which was a leading magazine on printing. half-tone printing and process printing. And I remember a comment made by the editor saying that staying so far away from the center of the process industry, I do not know how Mr. Ray could write such articles going into such details. So it is said that because his first books for children, the illustrations were spoilt by some problems with the wood engraver. So that is what led him to printing, and particularly printing of pictures, at which he became a master. So he came out with all these things, and he was also involved with the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. He taught Brahmo Sangit at the Sunday school of the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj, and wrote several Brahmo Sangits, not all of which are in use now. But even today, in the Brahmo Samaj, the Maghotsava festival begins with his Jago Purobashi and ends with his friends Pado Prante Rako Shevoke. So this is a tradition over which the old friends must be smiling and chuckling a bit, sitting up there. He was never involved in politics in any way. But when Rabindranath came out on Rakhi Bandhan Day in 1905, singing Banglar Mati, Banglar Jol in the streets, he immediately went out with his pakhwaj and accompanied the poet on his epic journey through various parts of the city. Even later, when he gave his epic speech at the Indian Association Hall, Upendra Kishore was there to accompany them. All these stories are written in different parts and these are known. But when he founded Sandesh, that was really sort of the peak of his career, because he had always wanted to have a children's magazine that would be special. He wrote in the first issue that Sandesh has two meanings. Sandesh means news in Bengali and Sanskrit. It is also a kind of sweetmeat of which children are fond. And he said, if my magazine has these two qualities, that the children would like it and it will also improve their minds and body, then I would consider myself satisfied. And what did he write there? He wrote poems, he wrote plays, he wrote short stories, he wrote songs with the notations and all for children. He wrote many articles on science, even on behavior, how to behave in public, and history, geography, lives of people, famous people. He presented news from all over the world. Unfortunately, the good days were numbered because he published Sandesh in 1913, in the month of May, that is Boishak, and by 1915, he was gone with diabetes, for which there was no treatment those days, and even medicine from Europe was not coming because of the German U-boat attacks. So he passed away almost without treatment, but he passed away very, very quietly. Now, he left behind 3 sons and 3 daughters. His eldest daughter was Shukhalata Rao, and the next brother was Shukumar. And he was, obviously, his fondness of Rabindranath can be seen that the nicknames of these two given were Hashi and Tata, based on the immortal child characters in Rabindranath's Rajarshi, which was first published in 1885, and these children were born in 86 and 87. So the connection is very clear. Hashi or Shukhalata was an excellent writer. She was a poet, and she wrote not only in Bengali, but she wrote in English and she wrote in Oriya also. She was married to Dr. Jyotirindra Rao, a noted Oriya Brahmo doctor. He also did social work, and because of his social work, he was led to write primers. He wrote primers for in Bengali for children, and one of these got the President's Award, just as she got another President's Award for writing his first story book, is basically translation of English fairy tales, called Golpo Ar Golpo. So both of these were prize-winning stories. The second brother, Shukumar, is then the hero of the second part of the story. We'll come to him later. Next comes Punnalata Chakraborty, the third child. Punnalata was married to a deputy magistrate in Bihar, and she did not have an opportunity to write earlier. But later on, she has contributed a lot of small stories, some of which came out as Chotto Chotto Golpo. But she's really famous for writing her memoirs of those days. And these have come out in Sandesh and in book form also in various parts. Next came Moni or Shubinoy Raychaudhuri, who was again an excellent writer, wrote poems, and he was extremely good at riddles, which came out in Sandesh and otherwise. He is one person known to have published a book on riddles. Unfortunately, that is also not traceable now anymore. Then came Tuni or Shantilota, who at an early age showed that she was a remarkable poet. But she passed away at a very early age of 27. So she has not left much. And then came Shubimol or Nanku, the youngest, who wrote some on history. He also wrote some whimsical tales. And he was generally very, very fond of children. So we children really appreciated coming in contact with him. So that is Upendra Kishore's immediate family. If we look at Shukumar now, Shukumar from a young age was a bit of a naughty boy, but he was full of spirits. He always thought up new games, new pranks, did all kinds of things. He became the leader of the children of the family and the children of the neighborhood, which was so-called Brahmo Para. And he led them all, and he formed his own club called Nonsense Club. And they had a small handwritten magazine they used to bring out called Share Buttrish Bhaja, which had all kinds of whimsy put into that. And not only that, he was also a very good student like his father, and he passed out in double honors in physics and chemistry from Presidency College. But academics was not for him. He wanted to assist his father and follow him in printing and bringing out books and writing. So he got the Guru Prasanna Ghosh Memorial Award and went to England for training for 2 years. Half of it was in London and half of it at Manchester. And this was a very interesting period, 1912-13. And this was a period when Rabindranath spent a considerable time there. In fact, Rabindranath had known him from earlier. In 1910, when he set up the so-called Chhatro Samaj, which later on became the Brahmo Youth Association, he asked Rabindranath for a name for their magazine, and the poet named it Alok. And for that he wrote this song, Aloy Alok Moy Kurehe Ele Alor Alo. So that connection was there, and Rabindranath always referred to him as my young friend. They were in close touch with each other in England, and he was able to hand over to Rabindranath the first issue of Sandesh. And Rabindranath was duly impressed, and he committed that he would write for Sandesh. But unfortunately, that did not materialize in Upendra Kishore's time. He came back in the same ship as Rabindranath and his family, landed in Calcutta, and immediately he gave his first contribution to Sandesh. And within 2 months, he was married. And he married Shuprabha, who was from a Brahmo family in Dhaka. And Shuprabha was an excellent Rabindra Sangit singer. Rabindranath was very fond of her songs. She has some records also which had been printed those days. And they moved into the new house at Gorpar Road, which Upendra Kishore had designed to accommodate the needs of the business, the press, and also the expanded family. Unfortunately, Upendra Kishore did not enjoy much of it since he passed away within a year and a half. But this was a period which saw Shukumar's genius really come to the fore. When Shukumar took over the editorship of Sandesh, Satyajit had made a comment saying that it was a children's magazine, and when my father took it over, he turned it into a young adults magazine, because he brought in new events, new kinds of things in which children who were a little older, maybe in their teens, they would be more and more interested. So everything changed. Shukumar contributed everything. He gave his everything to Sandesh, and there were some issues in which he had written 6, 7, 8 pieces and kept on contributing. He edited Sandesh for a little more than 8 years, and during this period he had 300 pieces, poems, stories, plays, slightly longer stories, it might be called novels today, but they're for children, and articles, many articles on science in various forms, and also on history, geography, and he also was interested in riddles. So he used to think up new games and new riddles. They used to come out in Sandesh. So the children used to wait and watch for this. There's an excellent comment by Shuninmal Bosu, who used to stay in Giridih. They were waiting for Sandesh, and they could suddenly see that the taste of the Sandesh had changed. So he didn't know. Then he came to know it was the father, he was editing it earlier, and now the son is editing it. So that was Sandesh, to whom he gave all, but that was not all. He also was devoted to printing. He developed new methodology. 3-4 of his articles were also published in that magazine. But he was not as well known in that contribution as Upendra Kishore. And he sang, he composed Brahma Sangits, there are a couple of his songs in the Brahma Sangit of today. And he was very active in the Chhatra Samaj, which later on became the Youth Association. In fact, he got Rabindranath deeply involved in it. Rabindranath was invited, he came, delivered several lectures which were enormously popular with the younger members of the Samaj. Unfortunately, some of the older and more rigid and conservative members of the Samaj were not drawn to Rabindranath. They were delighted when Rabindranath was awarded the Nobel Prize, but they did not sort of want to live up to Rabindranath's idea of what religion would be. So this was a problem, but he was dead set, and he came up with a proposal which was backed by his younger friends to make Rabindranath an honorary member of the Samaj. The older members of the Samaj kept on blocking it. Several years this went on like this. Ultimately in 1921, they brought in the proposal, and before that, his friend Prashanto Mahanabish with his assistants wrote a book called Kano Rabindranath Ki Chai. And apparently that turned the tide, and in the special general meeting, the vote was carried by 496 votes to 232. So it was quite a triumph. Upendra Kishore was not there, but Shukumar was very happy with that. And even before that, Shukumar did something. He set up a group, sort of a ginger group, which called themselves the Monday Club or Monda Club. Now, they used to come up with very interesting discussions, they used to go on tours, they would sing songs, they would come up with all kinds of things. Some of Shukumar's plays were enacted there. Rabindranath was invited there, and the poet Sotyen Dotto, who was a member of this, wrote the anthem for the Monda Club, saying Amader Monda Shommilon, which was really an adaptation of Amader poets, Amader Shantiniketan. People were a little scared that Rabindranath might take umbrage, but he did not. He was actually quite delighted. In fact, Rabindranath is known to have set to tune one of Shukumar's poems called Ganer Guto, which now it's the notations are available. And of course, Shukumar had his plays, which again had songs set to tune. He went to Shantiniketan, he staged his plays there, also participated in Rabindranath's Gorai Golod there. 1921 was a crucial year. On the one side, he won the battle for Rabindranath's honorary membership. On the second, he had his son, only son, Satyajit, born on the 2nd of May. Incidentally, it was proposed earlier that he would be named Prasad. But this didn't come through apparently because Ramananda Chattopadhyay's youngest son, who was also called Prasad, passed away a little before that time, and he was very close to this family. So the name was changed and became Satyajit. Fortunate for me, because otherwise I could not have inherited this name. But the problem was, before that, he made one of his last visits to the Zamindari in Mymensingh, and apparently picked up the fatal infection of Kala Azar. Now he came back and he nurtured, even with Kala-azar in him, for which there was no approved method of treatment. He went on struggling for more than 2 years, editing Sandesh, writing, doing all kinds of things, but he was not really able to keep up always. Several issues were missed out and he could not contribute in some parts, but this was a period in which he wrote such terrific stories as Abul Tabul, many of the poems of Abul Tabul, and he wrote Hojo Borolo, and he wrote Professor Heshoram Hushiarer Diary, which were actually a spoof on Professor Challenger's stories by Conan Doyle. And not only that, even on his deathbed, he continued to edit Abul Tabul, which was to come out in book form. He also completed the layout for Hojo Borolo. But unfortunately, Abul Tabul got delayed and came out 9 days after Sukumar passed away. And on his deathbed, he wrote the last poem of Abul Tabul, in which he cocked a snook at death and saying that death cannot fool me. I am not concerned with death. And around that time, he called Rabindranath. At his request, Rabindranath came, met him several times, sang songs at his request. And Rabindranath later said in his memorial speech and wrote also, saying that I have seen many deaths, but I have never seen a young man accepting death with such calmness, knowing that he has to go because there was no approved treatment. And the tragic part of this was, within a year of his passing, Dr. Brahmachari's treatment of Kala-azar with ureus tibamine was approved by the Indian Medical Council, and Dr. Brahmachari was actually quite close to this family. But there was no permission to try it out on human patients. So that was there, and Sukumar passed away. His son Satyajit was then barely 2 years old. He has very little memory of the father. So the magazine and the business, Uri and Sons, passed over to Shubinoy, the next son, who was quite good at writing and all kinds of things, but apparently his business sense was a little lacking. So, as if Sukumar's death was not bad enough, the family was plunged into deep darkness when it was found that a loan was taken for Uri and Sons and the press, and the whole the press, the business, the house, and even the Zamindari estate in Mymensingh were all put on hawk, and some money was raised, and the people who had loaned this money suddenly foreclosed. So there was no way in which the business could be kept. The business, the house, and everything went just like that, by auction. And the auction fetched such rock bottom prices that it smacked of some collusion between the people, the lenders, and some of his employees even. But nothing could be done. And the house at Jorashako, house at Gorpar, had been left behind by Satyajit, who was only 2.5 years old. Not 2.5, he was about 5 years old. He was holding Shuprabha's hands, and they walked out of that house with only his mother's Tridhan and a small educational allowance for the son. So overnight, the family was reduced from a comfortable situation to a situation of somewhat almost penniless. But it was fortunate that his maternal uncle, we called Shona Mama, called Prashanto Kumar Das, he came forward. He was living in hired accommodation in Bhawanipur. He extended his welcoming hands, and mother and son went over there. Not only them, but his grandmother also, who was, of course, Shona Mama's own mother. And later on, when another step-brother passed away, he supported his wife and her daughters, of whom were Joya and Bijoya, who were also excellent singers. So they were all brought up together, firstly at Bokul Bagan Road and later on at Beltola Road, in these two hired houses in Bhawanipur. So Bhawanipur was a new area. So they moved out of North Calcutta and Gorpar, came into Bhawanipur. Fortunately, his Choto Dadu or Chot Dadu was Pramodaranjan, had retired from the Survey of India by then, and he was living in hired accommodation in Bhawanipur. And Shubimal, the youngest uncle, also found shelter with them, and his Kakamuni or Shubinoy also hired a house in Bhawanipur. So the family gradually moved south. That is, the Brahmo group moved south, but Bukridaranjan's family and Sharadan's family stayed on in the north. But that did not really affect their relations. The relations continued to be very warm and smooth. Once he came in there, he developed, from a young age, he developed many interests. He was interested in arts and he was interested in music. He started listening to music on a small kiddie phone's gramophone, which was given to him by Prafullo Mohalanabish, whom he called Bula Kaka because he was Shukumar's friend. And he was also interested in whatever was going on around him, indoor games, carnivals, circus, magic, and all of that created such an impact on him that later on we find that he's in his movies, in his stories, all these things keep on featuring. So from a young age, this made an influence, a deep influence on him. But what probably is not realized is the role that Shukprabha played in this. Unfortunately, people have talked about the influence of the Ray family, his parental influence, grandfather's influence. But people have not spoken much about Shukprabha, except that very recently a book has been brought out by Tumpa Mukherjee, which acknowledges this. Now people, once I went through this, I found that Satyajit in a particular place had recorded, saying that I did not realize then what Ma did for us. She took a job. She was not dependent on her brother. She knew sewing and she knew embroidery, but she learned things like clay modeling and other handicrafts. And she went and met Lady Abola Bose and started working in Bidyasagar Bani Bhavan, which was, of course, way in the north. So Satyajit said, she fed me in the morning and she went out to work. And so he said, I had not realized then what my mother did for me, but I realize it now. And he also said that I have learnt how to work, if necessary, 18 hours a day from my mother. So these were his comments. Well, he went to school, which was Baligan Government High School, the same school to which two of my uncles went, and much later, well, I also went there. And did very well. But I have found from notes left by some of his friends that he was known for his songs, he was known for his artistic talents. It was also known that he was very interested in current affairs. They used to make scrapbooks and all kinds of things, make presentations in class. In that he was superb. He was interested in sports also a little bit. Not a great deal, but he was interested in sports. But they said, well, he was not a top-ranking student. He used to come out somewhere between 5th and 10th in the class, but he would always do well, and the teachers were very fond of him. Well, he did well enough in the exam to join Presidency College, from where he did his ISc and BSc. He did his graduation with honors in economics because he was advised to do so by his father's friend Prashanta Mohananavish. Unfortunately, he said later that he was not interested in economics. He didn't really like it, and he spent his time there. He did quite well in the exams, but he did not want to go into that or use that as part of building a career. So 1940 was the year when he graduated. And interesting things happened between 1940 and 1942. In 1940, Pagla Dashu came out as a book, and he was asked to design the jacket and also make some drawings inside. This was the first time he had done book designing, which was incredible. And then basically his mother Shukprabha was very interested. He was not. He was interested in art, commercial art. He was not interested in fine arts, particularly Indian classical fine arts. But partly to make her happy and partly to see what it is all around, maybe to learn a little bit of Oriental art, he went to Shantiniketan, spent 2 years there. Rabindranath was still there. He passed away after a year. And though he did not meet Rabindranath much, but he left a note that after that, a tie had somehow snapped. I felt the same attraction was not there in Shantiniketan anymore. The things he really gained there were threefold. One, a group of friends like Prithvish Niyogi and others who were really great. Second, he came close to Master Moshai, Nandalal Bosch, Ram Kinkar, and others. Well, when he was making documentary films, he came to Binod Bihari, on whom he made The Inner Eye. And that was, of course, an impression left on him by his Shantiniketan days. And he really held Binod Bihari in very high esteem. And the third was he came quite close to Professor Alex Sorensen, and he introduced him to the techniques, the grammar of Western classical music. He had a lot of books, he had records, and it is here that he got his formal coaching into this, though along with Bijoya, his cousin, they kept on listening to Radio Ceylon and even programs from BBC and Radio Berlin, always listening to Western classical music. Not really so much as Indian music. But he wrote later that music was in my blood. I grew up on Rabindra Sangit and Robo Sangit. And there were great singers in our family. So I did not really have to learn it later. But these were there. He also did something quite different. In 1941, he wrote a short story called Abstraction, which was published in Amrita Bazar Patrika. And next year, he wrote another, which was called Shades of Grey. Now, these were lost sight of. Hardly anyone had read them, and he had also almost forgotten about them. But now, if you look at the short story collection brought out by Ananda Publishers, the translations of these two stories are there. So this was the first time he took to story writing, though not for children. And other thing was that he started understanding the rural background at Shantiniketan, and he started developing some kind of a feel for this. 1942 was a unique year in Shantiniketan. For the first time, the school closed for summer vacation without the children staging one of Rabindranath's dance dramas or plays. That year, they staged Hojo Borolo by Sukumar Ray, and it was Satyajit who did the direction. This, so far as I know, this is the only time that he had directed a play in his life. In 1942, he came back. He was looking for a job in creative advertisement, and fortunately, he came into contact with a gentleman called Dilip Kumar Gupta, better known in this world as DK. They became friends, and they were friends for a number of years, and he was taken in to DJ Keemers, which is a leading advertising company here. And he, as he says, as junior illustrator and designer, at the princely salary of 80 rupees per month. But staying at home didn't really matter to him, and this was a new world to him. He was trained by Annoda Munshi to begin with, so that was also a good opportunity for him. And DK was then into publishing. So he opened his new company venture called Signet Press, and he started with books of Sukumar Ray and Upendra Kishore, which Satyajit was naturally drawn into this. And this was the first time he did jacket designing and book illustrations regularly. And not one or two, but 5 of those books were granted awards for excellence in printing by the government of India, the books that he had himself designed. He was made joint art director in DJ Keemers. But as he has mentioned wryly, at 1/3 the salary that his European counterpart, who was also a joint art director, was getting. Nevertheless, his opportunities were plenty, and he really went into the cinema world very seriously. They founded the Calcutta Film Society. He had his friends around him. They went into this. And in 1950, when Jean Renoir came here to direct The River, this was a great chance to him to act as understudy to the great director. Around that time, he wrote an article on Renoir called Renoir in Calcutta, which was later published in the British film journal called Sequence. I find this is the first ever article on films, serious article on films, that he got published. And the Calcutta Film Society, of course, gave him a lot of opportunities of discussing movies, working with people, but he was still working in the company. And for DJ Keemers, he came out with many excellent designs and sketches. Unfortunately, we do not always know which one was done by him and which one was not. But he made quite a name for himself. Ultimately, they made him art director. And as art director, he was sent to England and the continent for about 6 months. Within that time, he had shifted to a new hired accommodation, firstly in Lake Avenue and later on in Lake Temple Road on the south of the city. The locations of these are important. I'll come to that a little later on. But when he went there he had already got married the previous year to Vijaya. His mother was a little stiff about this to begin with, but ultimately she accepted. And it was not a forbidden relation, so he married, though she was a cousin, and they traveled together. What was interesting was that the letters that he wrote from England to his mother, now they have seen the light of the day during the lockdown period when his son Shondip was able to dig them out. And they speak of a new world opening up before him. He became a member of the London Film Club. And in the 6 months, of which maybe 4 months he spent in London, they saw 99 movies. And he kept notes, extensive notes on each and every one of them, who acted and how it was staged. Obviously, he was thinking of serious movie making. And on the way back from there, he came by ship. On the way back, he started writing the film script for Pather Panchali. And the idea, it is said, came to him when he was designing the jacket of the book Amatir Mepu for DK's Signet Press. So there is a close connection between that and the film world, and he went into this. Of course, people know that when he went into Pather Panchali, they were initially working on their own saved money, and this was in addition to his work as art director at DJ Keemers. Things were tight, and ultimately they found that they couldn't really manage it. Then his mother, Shuprabha, they came out with their ornaments and all, but Shuprabha also pulled out her resources. She found an old friend who was close to the Chief Minister of Bengal, Dr. Bidhan Chandra Ray, and he agreed to fund the program. So this was the first movie which was produced by the government of West Bengal. So when Pather Panchali came out, initially people made jibes, and people said that a movie like this cannot run without young women, without any love scenes, without major songs. But then, within a year, it won almost all the major laurels all around the world, and the world really opened up. After this, once it took a couple of other movies, he did Oporajito also, then he decided that he cannot combine the work of a commercial artist with the work of filmmaking. So he resigned from DJ Keemers, and since then they had been taken movie making as his full-time occupation. Another interesting thing happened in this period. In 1953, he had his son Shondip, and his mother, of course, was absolutely delighted. His mother, as I said, was really like a driving spirit, and she used to tell him two things. One was that she wanted him to do something on Rabindranath, because she was so fond of Rabindranath. And the other was she wanted him to revive Shandesh, which was the magazine that his father and grandfather before him ran. Unfortunately, though, he scaled new heights in movie making in this period. He did not make really a lot of money, and they were in that house at Lake Temple Road when ultimately she passed away at the end of 1960. And 61 was a fabulous year for Satyajit. In 1961 came the Rabindranath centenary. In the month of May, his documentary called Rabindranath came out. Also his Tinkanna, which was an adaptation of 3 stories of Rabindranath's. Of course, this traveled abroad as 2 daughters in some countries, but later on to some other countries as 3 daughters. And he was asked to design the postage stamp for the Rabindranath centenary. That is the only postage stamp that he has designed in his life. But he had maybe something like 50 or 60 pencil sketches of Rabindranath's face. And he could also modeled his calligraphy a bit on Rabindranath. So he excelled in that. And in the same year, in fact in the same month, May 1961, he came out with a republication of Sandesh. Unfortunately, his mother was not there. The Sandesh that came out in 1961 was a very different kind of a magazine to the other children's magazine like Shuktara and Shishushati, which were available then. Satyajit thought, again in a way like his grandfather and father before him, that he would do something new, something different. He planned it as a commercial magazine. So they took on hire a renter office at 172 Dharmotala Street. They had some paid full-time staff, some part-time staff, and he had a joint editor in the shape of Subhash Mukhopadhyay. The magazine came out with a bang. Subhash Mukhopadhyay's wife, Geeta Bandyopadhyay, wrote an excellent serial story called Piklu Shei Chotkan, and my aunt Leela Mujumdar wrote Tongling. These 2 by themselves would have set kids' minds aflame. But there were other short stories, there were articles, and this was the Tagore centenary year. So people like Arunendranath Thakur and Rothindranath himself, Mohanlal Gangopadhyay and others also wrote there. So the magazine really made a name. But what did Satyajit do? Satyajit had never written for children before this. The first issue of this was a poem, which was an adaptation of Lear's poem called Papangul. Tara Chakni Chore Shagor Padi Devei Deve. It was an amazing kind of an adaptation. Now people call it's not translation. Very difficult to translate those poems, but it could be transliteration or maybe a transcreation of things. And the first year he came out with 3 or 4 poems of Lear and Lewis Carroll, and also some by other poets. Later on, these have been compiled in the form of a book, which has been named Torai Bandha Ghorar Dev after Shukumar's nonsense rhymes. He also did something which came out a little later, that he translated or transliterated some of Shukumar Ray's Abul Tabul poems into a book called Nonsense Rhymes. So in a way, he was the first one to translate or transliterate Shukumar Ray. But to come back to Sandesh, there were a lot of interesting articles and stories, and it came out with really a bang. And he moved on from poems to stories also. First, he wrote something which was science fiction based. The notable stories of Bonku Babur Bondhu, and there were a number of others. He came up with his invented character of Professor Shonku, one who lived in Giridih. Interestingly, Giridih is a place to which Brahmos were inordinately drawn. His father and grandfather spent a lot of time in Giridih, so the whole place was like home ground to him. So Shonku lived in Giridih. He was born there, lived in Giridih. And Shonku was a double honors in physics and chemistry, exactly like Shukumar. Though he looked quite different, and he was in many ways a comical character, but he made strides there. Then he moved to write stories of other shades and other tastes. He wrote stories which had some science fiction or fantasy mixed in. He wrote stories which were sort of thrillers with last-minute twists. I recall a story called Fritz, where there was a toy which turned out to be a small-scale human being. I recall maybe Brown Sahib's Bari, where it was a ghost story, but the ghost was a cat, not a human being. I recall Septopused Khide, which was again a science fiction come fantasy of a huge man-eating tree. And there were many others. Some of them, even now, when I read them, they set my system on edge. But he came out with them one after another. He had not come up with the other famous character, Feluda, even then. But after 2 years, they realized that it would not run like this. The expenses were too high, and a commercial model did not work. So what was done was he gave up the office, he let the staff go, excepting one part-time staff, and the office was moved to 172 by 3 Rashbiari Avenue, where the Sandesh office continues even till today, where his aunt Purnalata Chakraborty used to stay. And in fact, the next house was the one which is Shona Mama, Prashanto Kumar Dash, who gave them shelter, had built his own house. I'll come to a funny story about that later, but they stayed there. And he moved on here, and for running the magazine, he thought of coming out with a different thing. It was the first ever magazine that was run by a cooperative society of authors, artists, and other people who were interested in Sandesh, called Sukumar Sahitya Samabay Samiti. Even today, Sandesh is the only magazine in India which is run by a cooperative society. So it went on like that, and Subhash Mukhopadhyay, of course, left as a joint editor, but Leela Majumdar joined him. Leela Majumdar had retired by then from All India Radio, so the two of them took over the editing, and Nolini Dash, his aunt Purnalata's second daughter, Nolini Dash was assisting them. All the work was being done in her house. But she had not reached. She was still principal of Bethune College, and she was not able to join formally. But a lot of the work she did from outside. So these three between them carried on, and maybe a few years later, I think that might have been 67 or 68 when Nolini retired and joined formally. So they were the three editors who used to run this triumvirate. They really ran Sandesh from 1961 to 1992, more than 30 years. And they called themselves Boro Sampadok, which was Leela Majumdar, the oldest of them. Major Sampadok was Nolini Dash, who was in between, and Sampadok Moshai, who was Satyajit Ray, who was the youngest, but then he was the main man. And it could be seen from the records that Satyajit was not a sleeping partner. Of course, the articles and contributions were screened by Nolini Dash and later on by Leela Majumdar. They improved some of the articles a little bit, but ultimately Satyajit called the shots. And he also made small comments. He called some of the contributors, asked them to slightly redesign the story or the poem, and even some of the illustrations he asked them to change. Of course, he did a lot of the illustrations himself. Something else was new. He came up with headpieces. The different sections of the magazine carried a headpiece which was designed by him. And one of the major important sections was the one called Prakriti Poruar Doptor, which started in 1962. It was the first live nature club that was ever run in any Indian children's magazine. And the gentleman who used to run it is still around, though he's not around to run around anymore. Sunil Bandopadhyay, who was known as Jimon Sardar, who took a lot of interest in this, and this was a live activity. And lots of stories, different contributed, all the major writers, Dhirendra Lal Dhar, Shibram Chakraborty, Narayan Gangopadhyay, and many others came. But a number of major long stories and novels and short stories came from Leela Majumdar, and Satyajit kept on writing. In 1965, the fourth year of Sandesh, he came out with his character Feluda, the amateur detective. He was not sure initially that he would really make a series of this, but that is what it turned out to be. He ended with 30 odd Feluda stories. Some were short, some were long. What is interesting is that Feluda and what he said, his sidekick was his cousin, Topshe. These two, they used to stay, Feluda's house, they used to stay initially in Tara Road and later in another house in that area. Now this area was very close to their houses in Lake Temple Road and Lake Avenue. So he knew that area quite well. This helped him, I think, to design the background and set the stories. And later on, when Lalmohol Ganguly or Jyotayu came in, lo and behold, Jyotayu is from Gorpar. And Jyotayu used to study and used to teach for some time at the Athenaeum Institution, the same school that bought up the old Upendra Kishore's house when it was ultimately auctioned off. So again, there he came back to an old background where he could fit in these stories. And some of the Shonku stories were really terrific. And it has also been noticed that Shonku stories involve not only his opponents and his friends, but it involved traveling. It involved traveling to different parts of India and even sometimes different parts of the world. And Shondip, his son, made an interesting comment saying that he made Professor Shonku travel to different parts of the world or even outside the world, because Shonku traveled to other parts of the solar system and the greater outer world. But Shonku traveled where Satyajit had not been able to go. But Feluda traveled wherever Satyajit had gone. So these areas he knew. Stories were set in Lucknow, stories were set in Shimla, they were set in Darjeeling, they were set in Delhi. And this background he knew like the back of his hand. So that enabled him to design the stories. And of course, they were very fond of detective stories. Not just Sherlock Holmes, but he had been through all the classical detective writers from the 1860s, 70s onwards. And not just he, his wife Vijaya was also used to devour detective stories. Shondip had recounted that sometimes after writing the first draft, he used to read it out to Vijaya and say, I want to know from her whether this sounded right. And only when she was satisfied, he finalized the script and published it. Speaking of Feluda and Shonku, these stories all began in Sandesh, but later on a majority of the Shonku stories, not a majority, many of the Shonku stories came out in Anandamala, and the majority of the Feluda stories came out in Desh. But this is something which the Sandesh readers sometimes took umbrage to. But as Manikda said, well, his writings bring him money. It enables him to run the household, not the films. But what is remarkable is the time he made out of this and the kind of notes he made in his mind, because he sometimes discussed with me some small things which I had written here and there. We were talking maybe 3-4 years later. He remembered it exactly. He remembered the manner in which I wrote it. He remembered my handwriting, and he said, your handwriting is very good. It's easy to read. But then he said, but not like your father's. And of course, I could not object to that because it was absolutely true. And he devoted a tremendous amount of time to this period. We know that over this entire period of his creative life, just as he made 29 films, he made some documentaries, and he made films for the TV. He also wrote more than 100 stories, and then there were long stories and novels. And later on, when he started making films, he had mentioned somewhere that Shondip told him that you have not made a single film for children. And that is what brought him back to his grandfather's creations when he made Gupigain Bagabain. I think it came out in 1969. But of course, he devised the rhymes and the songs, but he took the basic strands of the story, changed it somewhere wherever necessary, and it was a terrific hit. Later on, when he came out with a rerun, it was not written by Upendra Kishore, it was his own story. and his own composition music. So, in fact, till 1961, he had different music directors. In 1961, when he came out with Rabindranath, the documentary, it was the person whose birthday we are celebrating, Botugda, Jyotirindra Moitra, who was the music director of that. But after 61, he became the music director, he was a script writer, and for many of the films, he wrote the story himself. So that was quite a remarkable thing. And considering his achievements, the laurels he won from filmmaking, it has to be remembered that in 1980s were bad years for him. In 83 and 84, he had two major heart attacks. With government funding, he was taken to US, where he had an open heart surgery from probably the best open heart surgeon in the world, but it was not very successful. After that, for 7 years, he could not direct films himself. So he contented himself with only writing scripts and writing songs and giving directions, leaving some of the work to his son. And only towards the end, he was able to make 3 films. So the last 10 years saw only 3 films from him. He ended with Aguntuk. Incidentally, people may not know, but Aguntuk was derived from a short story which he wrote not in Shondesh. It came out first in one of the compilations of short stories done on the publishers, a story called Utithi. And that contains the germ of the story of Aguntuk, his last film. It has happened otherwise also, and of course, the 2 Feluda stories. In fact, he said that in the first Feluda story, when he designed the character of Lal Mohan Ganguly, it became so popular that it almost forced him to bring back Lal Mohan Ganguly repeatedly over and over again. And this brings me to the other story, that the house at 172 by 2 Rashmeri Avenue, which his uncle had built, where they stayed for a few years before moving to this house, which his uncle later sold. This house still stands, though there have been some changes. And when we started going to Shondesh office, this house was owned by whom? It was owned by Shamshed Jang Bahadur Rana of Nepal. And those who remember the Shonar Kella story would remember how he used this term, Shamshed Jang Bahadur Rana, and made Kamu Mukherjee ad, to Jong dekhi boja jacche, and all kinds of jokes about that. So that is the way in which he wove his tales. There were spins in them, and he brought in things that he knew, he brought in characters that he knew, even his famous villain, Maganlal Meghraj. If you come out of his house, the present house in which Shondip lives today, from Bishop Lefroy Road, and turn into Chorungi, look at the left, you will see a big advertisement saying Madanji Meghraj, which is a jewelers. And I am not sure, I am fairly sure that he got the name Maganlal Meghraj from there, and then he spun it into this tale. And of course, he had remarkable people like Kamu Mukherjee, who did amazing things, and including that the knife thrower roles and other roles elsewhere. And the songs that he wrote for this wherever necessary, including writing a Shama Shongit. It is said that his mother was quite shocked when he heard, what? You were a scion of a Brahmo family, you were writing Shama Shongits and singing them, but he did write one. And he wrote other kinds of songs also. He lent his voice wherever necessary. So he kept on doing everything, and towards many years, he sketched all the scenes of his films. And this is something I am told is very, very rare. Very, very few film directors have done it. And now some of these are coming out, being printed. Maybe they will all be soon available in public domain, but they're still not. And they're still preserved by the Rai Society, and they will come out later. Unfortunately, the illness, the heart problems, that continued. We remember that even when he was given the Legion of Honor, where the French President Mitterrand came to Calcutta to give it, he was not well, but at least he was able to go and accept it. But when the honorary Oscar was granted to him, he was actually on his deathbed. He was in the hospital, and when they came, it was handed over to him at the hospital bed. But he mentioned very clearly, it had been written somewhere also, that this Oscar was something else. He said the Academy Award is something like a Nobel Prize for filmmakers. So it was very, very important for him. And the very fact it was given to him even at the fag end of his life was important. It rang a bell somewhere. Well, again, that brought us to 1992, and after the heart attacks, his heart problems, he passed away. And from 92 till 2021, almost 30 years, Sandesh had been muddling on, but we went through a very bad patch around that time, because not only him, we lost Ashokananda Das, who was Jivanananda's younger brother, who was the printer of Sandesh in within a year, and then we lost Nolini Das, his co-editor. And even Leela Majumdar was seriously ill. And so Bijoy Rai and Shandip, and later on Shandip, took over the publishers. But somehow we have been carrying on with Sandesh, which is nowhere near what it was like in its heyday, but is still going on. And it gives us memories. At times it brings back sparks of what they used to do. And we have found many small notes which the editors exchanged among themselves, making their comments about particular contributions, what should be done about them, who should be called and encouraged, who should be asked to control a little. One of our authors, who is no longer around, but I still don't want to name him, had a perfectly horrible handwriting, and his spelling was very bad. And he was told repeatedly that whenever you have, I know you can't do anything about the handwriting now, but if you have doubts about the spelling, why don't you check in the dictionary? He answered with a broad smile, I never have any doubts then, but when you point out the mistake, well, maybe it was a mistake. So Sandesh kept them engaged. Sandesh took a lot of their time, but it also sort of wove a new kind of life around them, of which I was on the periphery. I could see only some of it from a distance. I am now a little more deeply involved. But this is what he achieved, this remarkable man. So he was, of course, a polymath, a poet, a translator, short story writer, a novelist, of course a filmmaker, not just a filmmaker, a script writer, a lyricist who wrote his own songs, and an artist. He has done everything almost. Not only that, he started designing fonts. And this is something that has remained in the family for 3 generations. Upendra Kishore did some thing about fonts of the scripts. Shukumar designed some scripts, and he designed 4 scripts, 2 of which, the Ray Roman and Daphnis, won international awards also. So he won awards not just for his stories and poems, or his printing, or his movies. He won awards for designing these scripts. And that brings me back to the point of this period of the Bengal Renaissance. I find of the books that have been written about him, people have referred to his parents and all. But this point of the family lineage and how the lineage worked has been brought out in a recent book. And in that, they have entitled it Creativity and Modernity. To me, Renaissance is all about creativity and modernity. All the people who contributed to Renaissance were creative, and they moved the world maybe into a modern world, the old Renaissance or the Bengal Renaissance. And even this remarkable family, particularly these 3 remarkable gentlemen before us. And why 3? Even his son and his grandson are now into the same business. It's a rare case where for 5 generations a family has served a magazine, they have served the film world, not for 5 generations, but for 3 generations. But Shukumar wrote articles on cinema and how vision, persistence of vision and so on, the thing behind cinema. But Upendra Kishore had not. So this is something that is important to me, that is how the family bonds were together, and the bond took them on to move towards from tradition towards a new world, towards modernity, and towards creativity. And it is too much to expect that we could carry that on. But that was carried on, and therefore, in my eyes, these three people and those around them, the people of the extended Ray family, and even the extended Gupta family, which is the parental family of Shuprabha, we're all into this. After all, people like Atul Prasad Sen and others belong to that family, Shahana Devi. So some of his genes came from that. And Satyajit wrote somewhere that I am a great believer in genes, because he said, when I grew up with my uncle's house, and there was no poet there, no musician, no artist, and there was no spark of any creativity. They were all middle class householders, very good people, very good to children, but it was not there. And he said, I really believe that if my father had been with us for another 10 years or maybe 15 years, maybe my creativity could have been sparked much earlier. Later on, he said, my creativity only started towards the end of my college days, and really only at Shantiniketan, where specifically mentioned the professors of English and people like Ram Kinkar Bej, who of course impressed him so much that he made that documentary film on him. So this is something that he himself felt and wrote. And there he said, and it's not just my father's family, my mother's family also had great musical talent, and the two channels mixed together and the combined genes made me what I am. And I think that is a great saying. He acknowledged the people before him, and we only hope that some of these trends of creativity and modernity will go on even after him. But this year was a centenary year. Unfortunately, most of the public functions had been cancelled because of the pandemic. Maybe before the centenary year concludes, there will be some more public functions. But I am really grateful again to the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Committee for organizing this, for focusing on Satyajit Ray and the Ray family, and for asking me to deliver this lecture. Unfortunately, because it's a recorded version, there cannot be question and answer sessions, but if it is there on the YouTube, and if there are questions marked, maybe we can respond to some of them later on, but we will see about that. But thank you so much, the people of the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Committee. Interesting, that is such a big name, but then I found the children from Patho Bhavan and Kamala Girls School also kept on referring to him as Botukta, whatever their age. So he was also a timeless kind of a person, like Manikda. And people asked me, they talk to me, they said, he must be your uncle, he's so big. I said, he is 27 years older than me. And he is big in many ways, not just in height, in many ways. But he is a cousin, he's not an uncle. Shukumar was my uncle, but I never had the opportunity of seeing him. But even Satyajit never saw his grandfather. This discussion today brought me back to some of the old stories, these old people, and maybe I could bring some of that ideas through to you. I do not know how far I succeeded, but I must thank the Jyotirindra Moitra Memorial Committee, and particularly Susmita and the others. Thank you so much.
That was a brilliant and involved narration of the roots of the illustrious Ray family and a very personal perspective of the world-famous maestro Satyajit Ray, which enriched us immensely. We would have been happy to have invited live questions from the audience, but due to limitations of net connections, we shall encourage the audience to put their questions and observations in the YouTube platform, where the speaker would be happy to address them. I would now like to profusely thank our illustrious speaker for his brilliant lecture, the audience for being with us and encouraging us, And I would also like to thank Shayantan for the technical support. And we would now end this session with the landmark song of Jyotirindra Moitra, Esho Mukta Karo.
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা।
এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা।
রসরূপ মন্ত্র দ্রষ্টা।
ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার।
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
দিকে দিকে ভেঙেছে যে শৃঙ্খল, দুর্গত দলিতেরা পায় বল।
দিকে দিকে ভেঙেছে যে শৃঙ্খল, দুর্গত দলিতেরা পায় বল।
এ শুভ লগ্নে তাই তোমারে স্মরণ করি রূপকার। এ শুভ লগ্নে তাই তোমারে স্মরণ করি রূপকার। এসো মুক্ত করো হে এই দ্বার।
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
উঠেছে যে জীবনের লক্ষ্মী, মৃত্যু সাগর মন্থনে।
উঠেছে যে জীবনের লক্ষ্মী, মৃত্যু সাগর মন্থনে।
নূতন পৃথিবী চায় শিল্পীর বরাভয়, নব সৃষ্টির শুভক্ষণে।
নূতন পৃথিবী চাই শিল্পীর বরাভয়, নব সৃষ্টির শুভক্ষণে।
এসো সমিতির সাম্যে ঐক্যে।
এসো জনতার মুখরিত সখ্যে।
এসো সমিতির সাম্যে ঐক্যে। এসো জনতার মুখরিত সখ্যে।
এসো দুঃখ তিমির ভেদি দুর্দম ধ্বংসের নিষ্ঠুর ভয় করি চূর্ণ।
এসো দুঃখ তিমির ভেদি দুর্দম ধ্বংসের নিষ্ঠুর ভয় করি চূর্ণ।
এসো প্রাণের ভবন করো পূর্ণ।
এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। রসরূপ মন্ত্র দ্রষ্টা। ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। ছিন্ন করো বন্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো